A heavyset man threw a firework at the feet of a guard, but his boldness turned into a shock for everyone. The guard's reaction turned into a real spectacle. London gleamed in the sunlight, as if the city had prepared itself specifically to showcase its beauty to the tourists. Crowds buzzed outside Buckingham Palace. Cameras clicked, children ran across the square, and enthusiastic voices created a constant hum. The royal guards, majestic in their red tunics and enormous bearskin hats, stood as still as tradition itself. Among them was James Harper. His tall stature, stern expression, and immaculate uniform made him the embodiment of honor and discipline. The crowd gazed at him in admiration, but not everyone shared the sentiment. Suddenly, the focus shifted to a man who looked like he'd just wandered off a beach party. Bare-chested, with a sagging belly, orange shorts that had clearly seen better days, and sunburned, blotchy skin. He clutched a can of beer in one hand and a small firework in the other. His brazen demeanor screamed that he wasn't there to appreciate tradition. He was there to put on his own show. "Hey, Iron Man!" he shouted, puffing out his chest like he was in a boxing ring. His voice pierced through the crowd's murmur. "Are you even alive, or are you just good for photos?" James remained impassive. His gaze was fixed somewhere far away, as though this loud man didn't even exist. "Yeah, I thought so," the man continued, tossing his beer to a friend. "You're just a statue. Maybe this place needs a little excitement." The crowd fell silent, watching his antics. Some people pulled out their phones, sensing something inappropriate was about to happen. Typical. People who think the whole world is made just for them, anyone might have thought. The man, pleased with the attention, pulled out a lighter. "Well, let's see if he can handle this," he added with a smirk, lighting the firework. The next second, the firework exploded with a loud crack at James's feet. Sparks flew in all directions, and the air filled with the sharp smell of sulfur. The crowd gasped. Some recoiled in shock, but James remained as motionless as ever, his face unflinching, as if the explosion were no more than a gentle breeze. "What a stoic!" someone exclaimed from the crowd. But the shirtless man wasn't ready to give up. His face reddened with anger, and he turned to the onlookers, expecting applause for his stunt. Instead, he was met with chuckles and disapproving looks. "Well then," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Guess I'll have to step it up." His friends exchanged nervous glances, and the crowd began to murmur. There was a palpable sense that something even more foolish was about to happen. James, calm as ever, stood tall, an unshakable symbol of British tradition. The man seemed to think that his tourist status gave him license to do whatever he wanted, but he had no idea his antics would lead to his ultimate humiliation. The heavyset man, frustrated that his firework hadn't even elicited a twitch, stepped closer. He crossed the white line, a symbolic boundary that tourists were strictly forbidden to breach. The crowd visibly tensed, and someone even let out a quiet gasp. "Are you even alive?" he bellowed, waving a hand directly in front of James's face. His voice carried irritation, and his movements grew increasingly erratic. James, of course, didn't budge. He was as still as a statue, an embodiment of royal composure. "Or are you just stuck in your discipline? What, can't even crack a smile?" The man sneered, now addressing the crowd rather than the guard. The crowd murmured amongst themselves. Some turned away, unwilling to witness his foolish behavior. Others began recording the scene, anticipating a viral moment. "Hey, you! Stop that!" an elderly woman with a cane shouted. Her face was a mixture of annoyance and shame for the man's actions. "This isn't a circus, it's the Royal Guard!" But the man only smirked, his beer belly shaking with laughter. "Royal, huh?" he mocked, patting his stomach. "I paid for tickets to this, and I want a show." His friends, standing a little distance away, exchanged uneasy glances. Even they seemed to realize he was crossing a line. Suddenly, he pulled out an even larger firework from his pocket. This time, he moved slowly, deliberately drawing as much attention to himself as possible. The crowd froze. "Well, let's see what he does with this one," the man declared, lighting the fuse. The firework hissed and flew straight to James's feet, exploding with a deafening bang. Smoke and sparks filled the air, accompanied by the acrid smell of sulfur. The crowd gasped again. Some stepped back, covering their ears. When the smoke cleared, James was still there, unshaken, his expression unchanged. His unflinching calmness was almost surreal. "What a legend!" someone shouted from the crowd. People began clapping, impressed by James's stoicism. But the man wasn't pleased. His face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Oh yeah? Well, I'll show you," he began, taking another step closer to James. At that moment, James moved. Slowly, with deliberate precision, he raised his right foot and flicked the remnants of the firework to the side, as if brushing away a speck of dust. His gaze remained steady, his face devoid of any emotion. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. "That was amazing!" someone yelled. "Incredible!" added another. The heavy-set man, now feeling foolish and humiliated, wasn't ready to give up so easily. His friends began nervously calling him back, but he waved them off. "He's just a robot," the man shouted, trying to drown out the applause. "I'll show him who's boss." His actions became increasingly desperate, but the crowd, recognizing his absurdity, had fully turned in support of James. What would happen next? The tension in the air was electric. The heavy-set man, enraged that his antics hadn't had the desired effect, now felt cornered. The crowd was no longer laughing with him. They were laughing at him. The sense of humiliation overwhelmed him, and he decided to take drastic action. "What? He's just standing there?" he shouted, turning to the spectators. His face was flushed, and his voice grew louder, as if he were trying to drown out the rising whispers of disapproval. "This is ridiculous." "You're the ridiculous one," someone called out from the crowd. "Hey, get him out of here," added an older woman, indignantly pointing her cane at the man. The heavy-set man tensed, his movements becoming jerky. He took a few lumbering steps toward James, crossing the white boundary line and standing directly in front of the guard. "All right, you asked for this," he muttered, breathing heavily. His eyes darted between James and the crowd, which now silently watched the escalating scene. Slowly, he reached out his hand toward James's bearskin hat. He seemed to think that this final gesture would restore his dominance and recapture the crowd's attention. But then, something completely unexpected happened. "Step back!" The command, delivered in James's booming voice, rang out like thunder. The man recoiled, his hand frozen in midair. The sheer volume and suddenness of the order seemed to paralyze him. The crowd collectively gasped, followed by a roar of applause. In his confusion, the man tripped over his own shorts and landed on the ground with a heavy thud. For a moment, he sat there, blinking in bewilderment, before clumsily scrambling to his feet. But by then, dozens of phones in the crowd had captured every second of his humiliation. "This is disgraceful," the elderly woman with the cane declared, glaring at him. "People like that don't belong here." "Get out before it gets worse!" shouted a young man with a camera. The crowd began booing and jeering. The man, now red to the tips of his ears, started backing away in retreat. "Let's go, guys!" he barked at his friends, trying to cover his face with his hand. He hurried off, panting heavily and glancing nervously over his shoulder. His friends, visibly relieved, trailed after him without a word. As the commotion subsided, the crowd turned its attention back to James. His face remained composed, as though nothing had happened. He stood tall and proud, exactly as he had at the start of the day. An older gentleman in a tweed suit stepped forward, his eyes filled with admiration. "Thank you for your service, sir. You are a true pride of Britain." With a barely perceptible motion, James adjusted his bearskin hat and resumed his rigid pose. It seemed as though his silence spoke louder than 1,000 words ever could. The next day, the internet exploded. A video titled "Firework Guy vs. Royal Guard, Who Won?" went viral, amassing millions of views worldwide. Viewers praised James's composure and dignity while condemning the tourist's audacity. "Now that's real stoicism," one commenter wrote. "The Royal Guard is a symbol of honor. That tourist is an embarrassment to anyone visiting London," added another. The heavy-set man became a laughingstock, while James Harper received an outpouring of gratitude. Honor and tradition had once again triumphed over provocation.